Thank you, Julie, and thank you to John and Tony for inviting me to talk this afternoon. I think I've probably had an association longer than most people in the room. I think I met John back in 1988 when he was starring in a cardiovascular trial. Those are my disclosures, which I'll quickly pop over. I could just give this and say this is the only slide I need to show. This shows the success of treatment and risk factor management in Australia with the decline in age-related deaths from cardiovascular disease since its epidemic proportions in the 1950s right on through till today. As I say, the reason why that's occurred has been for two reasons. One has been risk factor management, and the other has been better and improved treatments of cardiovascular diseases. And the Clinical Trials Centre has been involved in landmark trials in both of these areas. The biggest change in a risk factor point of view has been smoking. Of course, the data for that predates 30 years ago, but the data around how we get people to stop smoking has been the topic of much research over the last 30 years, and really a huge success story for Australia in particular. In terms of treatments for risk factors, the Clinical Trials Centre has been the leader in Australia in the management of cholesterol management, and I'll come back to the lipid trial and the future trials around lipid management. And in terms of acute myocardial infarction, they led the landmark trial, which really set the scene for all the improvements we've seen in the management of AMI in the hospital. So for those of you who can remember back in the 1980s, if you arrived in the hospital in one piece, and important to say we haven't changed the bit before the hospital, you had a 13% chance of dying. If you arrive today, you have a 3% chance of dying. A huge improvement in the treatments. And that's been because of the originally fibrinolysis and then moving on to primary PCI and a pharmacoinvasive therapy, which if you live in a big city in Australia, you will be able to get. So the first trial I want to talk about is the GUSTO trial. This was a trial of 40,000 patients, one of the biggest trials, if not the biggest trial ever in cardiovascular medicine. And I just want to draw your attention to two things. Australia put in 2,287 patients. And today that would be an enormous challenge, and I think that's one of the things we might talk about. The other is if you look at the countries involved in this trial, they were all from North America and Western Europe. There were none from Eastern Europe or Asia, which is another one of the big challenges in today's environment. Now this trial was just comparing two fibrinolytic agents, blood thinners. And really, you'd say that wasn't terribly interesting. But this paper by John Symes was really seminal in changing the way people thought about acute myocardial infarction and set the scene for how we manage it in the current era. For those of you who aren't familiar with the cardiology jargon, TIMI 3 flow over here means your artery is normal and working normally. TIMI 0 flow means your artery is occluded. And what this demonstrated was that there was reopening the artery. Didn't matter how you did it, as long as you reopen the artery, you will improve the mortality of acute myocardial infarction. And many would say this was the most important paper that came out of the whole of the GUSTO trial. The GUSTO trial led to the establishment of an organization called the VIGOR organization with multiple universities and academic research organizations around the world. I don't have time to name all of them, but I guess Duke University was the center of it, and Leuven back then, and Flinders has been involved, as has Green Lane in Australia. This group performed many of the trials which form the evidence base for the management of acute coronary syndromes. Just list them there. Again, time doesn't permit me to go through them, but you can see a large number. It also has worked on lipid therapy, and it also worked in the area of heart failure. So a very active group that has really contributed to improvements in cardiovascular health care. No talk of the CTC would be possible without talking about the lipid trial, the long-term intervention with pravastatin in ischemic heart disease. I think this trial, would be fair to say, was what set the trial centre on its basis and how it moved forward and got such a good reputation. This was a study in Australia and New Zealand. There were 87 participating centres, 67 in Australia. Again, that will be an enormous challenge today. It was funded by the National Heart Foundation, but with industry sponsorship, and the trial centre was the clinical research organisation that managed all the data. This was the result. Now, today, all of you would think we knew all there was to know about lipid management and statins. Today, there seems to be no argument. But back then, there was a huge debate as to whether lowering cholesterol would have any effect on the outcomes of cardiovascular disease. And this demonstrated really for the first time in people with a normal in inverted commas cholesterol, that by lowering cholesterol with a statin, you reduce the overall mortality of these patients, and has led to the huge progress in the treatment and the management of lipids. This was in the New England Journal in 1988, pictures of John and Tony, major participants, and Wendy Haig, who I've known from back in those, is also a major participant. And this is what lipid showed us. It was the landmark from saying it isn't high cholesterol. If you've had a cardiac event, your cholesterol is too high for you. That was a message, a new message that has shaped the way we now work. It confirmed the safety profile of statins. Again, for those of you who are around, there was great concerns about the safety profile, and one in particular, in a trial that was running at the same time, there was concerns about breast cancer. It's been a rich source of biomarker research, and it has also demonstrated yet again what we call the legacy effects. So this is a trial that keeps on giving. This is a 16-year follow-up of the trial published in Circulation 3 years ago now, demonstrating that a short course of statins for about 4 or 5 years has a profound legacy effect. So lowering your cholesterol for that period of time still reduces cardiovascular death 16 years later. So the trial was a landmark trial showing the benefit of statins, and has allowed us to continue to look at the outcomes moving forward to this point. It's one of the dot points on this, which is from the Cholesterol Trialists collaboration, which Tony and John are leaders, and which I think is now housed here at the Clinical Trial Centre. And this puts together all the cholesterol trials from around the world, hundreds of thousands of patients, demonstrating that for each 1 millimole reduction in LDL cholesterol, you get about a 20% reduction in cardiovascular events. And the experience with lipid trials is moving forward still. Tony was one of the lead investigators in this trial, the Fourier-TIMI-59 trial, which showed with a new drug, ivolocumab, a PCSK9 inhibitor, that if you lower cholesterol to levels some of us would never even dream of, so the average was 0.78 of a millimole. So for those of you who don't know cholesterol, most of us have a cholesterol maybe 2.5 to 3 if we're lucky, some a lot higher. We used to have a target of getting your LDL down under 1.8 if you had a heart attack. This is getting your LDL down to 0.78. Some people had LDLs down 0.3 or 0.4. And this showed a remarkable reduction in cardiovascular events to go with this new method of lowering cholesterol. So this keeps on providing new data on risk factor management. The other area that CT has been very active in which Tony's been a leader, is in the area of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. This has become an increasing interest as diabetes increases. Now around 30% of patients entering coronary care have diabetes. We recognize with the increasing obesity in the population, it's only going to get bigger, and the correlation between diabetes and cardiovascular disease. This trial of 9,000 patients was led by Tony, was published in The Lancet in 2005. Disappointingly, some would say it was a negative trial, and strictly speaking, the primary endpoint of death or non-fatal MI was not lower compared to the placebo group. However, there were a whole lot of other outcomes that came from this so-called negative trial, and particularly it demonstrated beneficial effects on microvascular disease, which are now leading to improvements in outcomes for diabetic patients. So although a negative trial, and that's something we might discuss later, what is the value of a negative trial, when you have other endpoints in the trial, we can see there are some major benefits. 1 minute. Okay, this is the end. So in summary, we've seen major improvements in cardiac outcomes. We've seen more evidence, I haven't said this, we have more evidence in the area of cardiology than any other area of medicine. It's still only about 60% of our treatments are evidence-based, but that's more than many areas where it's more like 5%. And the Clinical Trial Centre has been a major contributor to the development of this evidence, both locally and internationally. I was asked to comment on 2 things: why you do clinical research. I think you do it to the intellectual stimulation. When I did my PhD, it was very nice for a moment to know I knew more about some subject than anyone else in the world. And it's also to have fun. And it's been great fun cooperating with people around the world, particularly in pushing back the frontiers of science. The challenge is we'll talk later. Thank you very much.